Show.
You're a great American.
He's a great guy.
Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHAL.
Well, good morning. It's Thursday. I'm Ross. Thursday is my favorite day of the week. Fantastic to be with you. I will let you know I'm going to be out tomorrow. Leland Conway will be in for me. If you're looking for something to do Friday and or Saturday, check out the Steamboat Institute Annual Freedom Conference. It's Friday and Saturday, and that's where I'm going to be. Mandy Connell will be there too. It's tomorrow and the next day. The Steamboat Institute is actually, I know it's the Steamboat Institute, but they're actually doing it in Beaver Creek this year at the Park Hyatt. There are a few seats left, not a lot, but a few. And some of the speakers are going to include Heather McDonald, Charlie Kirk, Kim Strassel from the Wall Street Journal. We're going to have a Zoom presentation, a Zoom conversation with Rick Grenell, the former ambassador to Germany and acting director of national intelligence, who was a featured speaker at the Republican National Committee convention last night. So and it goes on and on. Molly Hemingway will be there in person. Victor Davis Hanson by Zoom. Art Laffer by Zoom. John Eastman, very interesting dude. Lawyer. The lawyer who was the guy who started some controversy a couple weeks back when he asked a question about whether Kamala Harris was eligible to be vice president of the United States. He didn't say she wasn't. He asked the question, but he got in big trouble for it. Did you know that John Eastman is actually the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy this year at CU Boulder? He's actually teaching. He's yeah, right. He is not an original founder of Kodak, although I bet he wishes that he were, because then he would have big, big money. Anyway, we got plenty of other great speakers. Just go to steamboatinstitute.org if you want to learn more. Steamboatinstitute.org. Mandy Connell and I will both be working as sort of MCs there as they spread the event out over a couple of rooms to maximize the social distancing and all that. So anyway, that's where I'll be tomorrow, and the fantastic Leland Conway will be in for me tomorrow. Now, I did watch for the third night in a row the Republican National Convention, Committee Convention, I guess, technically, and I'm going to share a bunch of audio with you throughout the show on it. I will say, overall, it wasn't nearly as interesting as the previous two nights. I thought the first night was best. I thought the second night was pretty good. Not as good as the first night, but pretty good. I thought last night was kind of dull. Not every moment was dull. And I'm not saying it was bad. It just didn't grab my attention quite as much as the other nights did. But it did end up with a half an hour speech by Vice President Mike Pence, who did his best not to be dull. He's naturally dull. But you know what? There's a certain aspect of being dull and competent that I appreciate a lot, and being someone who isn't always making flamboyant news headlines. When I lived in Australia, there was a prime minister, very well-known, long-serving prime minister of Australia named John Howard, and he was a conservative. He would, I guess, if you were to put him in an American spectrum, you'd probably call him a moderate Republican. Not that there are a lot of those left, but you'd probably call him a moderate Republican. And one of the reasons I loved John Howard was he was the most boring man ever. And he just exuded stability and competence. And I think mostly that's what Mike Pence exudes as well. So I don't hold it against him that he's not the most exciting guy in the world, because lots of times I don't want the most exciting guy in the world. I'm going to share a bunch of Mike Pence sound with you, other sound as well, Kellyanne Conway, Rick Grenell, and others throughout the course of the show. But I want to start off with something different. I did not spend much time yesterday talking about the violence in the streets and what's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after the shooting of Jacob Blake, a shooting where we are still getting more information, and I have to say the whole thing still seems pretty confused as to what happened. The story's changing here and there, bit by bit, in ways that could actually be quite important to understand the mindset of the police officer who was a 7-year officer in the Kenosha Police Department. And look, I'm not expert on all of this. I'll just tell you a couple of things that I've read in the past day or so, and that might be a little bit different from how the story was originally reported. So it was reported to begin with that Jacob Blake was breaking up a fight between 2 or more other people. Now it's being reported that he may be the one who was the subject of a call to the police by a woman saying that a guy had taken the keys to her house and wouldn't give them back, and it was sort of a domestic, as they call it, a domestic disturbance. Unclear that it had resulted in any domestic violence at that point, but it does seem that maybe Mr. Blake was actually the subject of the call rather than some kind of good Samaritan or bystander who jumped in to try to help a situation. Again, I don't know what the answer is. That's just more recent reporting. Other more recent reporting. The police were told by Blake that he had a knife. And after all this went down, and you recall the way this ended, is Blake walked around to his car and started to lean in, and a police officer who was pulling on his shirt but didn't have him under control. And there are a lot of questions about why they basically allowed the guy to get up and walk around. But anyway, police officer shot him in the back as the guy leaned into the car with the police officer, trying to restrain him and telling him not to. They found a knife on the floorboard where he was leaning in. And now, of course, the question is, did he have the knife in his hand, drop it when he was shot, or was the knife in the car the whole time? That's another thing we're trying to learn, or the police are trying to learn. On the one hand, it's very important to know the facts from the simple perspective of trying to achieve justice, right? It's important to know what happened and what didn't. It's important to know what the real story is versus urban legend when you're trying to do things like determine if a police officer should be suspended or fired or prosecuted versus if it was a terrible event but justifiable. I'll give you 2 obvious examples of difference in reverse order chronologically, but the police officer who killed George Floyd shouldn't have done what he did and shouldn't have done anything the way he did it. Whereas if you think all the way back to one of the first, at least first in recent years, so without looking back towards, the 1950s and 60s, in recent years, one of the first really major events to cause major uproar in the streets was what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, where this kid named Michael Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer. In that story, the way the urban legend made its way around is Michael Brown just stood there as the cop got out of his car or pulled a gun up as he was sitting in the car. I'm not sure how they even really tell the story, but Michael Brown put his hands up and said, "Don't shoot." And you ended up with all these protests of protesters saying, "Hands up, don't shoot," as if the cop in that case shot an innocent, unarmed guy who wasn't doing anything. But that wasn't the case. Michael Brown had just committed a robbery, and then, according to investigations, reached into the police car as the police officer made contact with Michael Brown, believing Michael Brown possibly to be the suspect from the robbery based on the description of the suspect. Michael Brown, according to the investigations, reached into the car, tried to get the cop's gun, and was shot. It was justified, it was justifiable, and the police officer was not charged, not prosecuted, even by liberal prosecutors in that state. So these are two very different stories. But the reason that I started this part of the conversation by saying it matters a little bit that we find out, or maybe more than a little, but maybe not as much as I would like, that we find out exactly what happened. For example, did the police officer feel threatened because he knew that Jacob Blake was holding a knife? I don't know. I hope we find out. It matters because the public needs to know. It matters because we need to know what should happen to that police officer. But unfortunately, in a certain way, it doesn't matter. And how is that? It doesn't matter in the sense that you still will have, when they get in the mood to remember Michael Brown, thousands of protesters walking around with their hands up saying, hands up, don't shoot, even though they know or should know that that was not what actually happened. They don't care. They make the message whatever they want to make the message to achieve their political aims, even if lying about what happened in a situation like that is extremely harmful to their entire communities. And I thought of that this morning, and it's too bad that I thought of that because this is otherwise, I think, a very heartfelt kind of message that I want to share with you in the context of all of this that's going on, in the context of what's going on in professional sports right now, that I'm sure will be a topic for coming days as well. One of my favorite news sources is a website called Axios, A-X-I-O-S. It's become a large and important news source in a relatively short period of time. Reporter who you might know from interviews of President Trump and other people, an Australian guy named Jonathan Swan, really good reporter. Anyway, I like Axios.com. It's a good source, and they have other kind of sub-sites and daily newsletters. One of them involves financial markets and trends in the economy and things like that. And the editor of that, of Axios Markets, is a guy named Dion Rabouin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dion Rabouin. Dion Rabouin. And Dion is a black guy. He's a very good writer, and I like reading his stuff a lot. And I look forward each morning to looking at the newsletter in my inbox, seeing what he is writing about. And here is what he wrote today. Quote, I can't write a newsletter today. NBA players began a strike last night, refusing to play basketball and effectively saying that while we cannot control the laws or the courts or the actions of others, what we can control is ourselves. We control our bodies and our minds, and no matter what you take from us, you cannot take that. Whenever someone stands up to fight for justice, one must always ask whether that stand is a moment or a movement. I hope that what the NBA started last night was a movement. I hope it was a movement for change and a movement for justice and equality. I don't have much to give to that movement, but I have my body and I have my mind, and I have this little newsletter that you all read. Maybe I can make a difference somehow by showing that you don't have to be a superstar to take a stand. Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times while walking away. To my eyes, he walked away because he was sick and tired of being harassed by armed agents of the state whose occupation is supposed to be to protect him. I don't know Jacob Blake, but I know what it's like to be tired of police harassment and to decide that enough is enough. So did Eric Garner. That's a different story. So did Sandra Bland. So did many others. This must end. He continues. I've been stopped and frisked. I've been assaulted. I've been thrown to the ground or on the hood of a car and handcuffed by these same armed agents of the state for the crime of looking suspicious or being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong skin. And I know exactly what it's like to have that pit well up in the back of my throat as I decided that I had taken enough. I was fortunate enough not to end up dead or paralyzed. Many of you reading this are CEOs, presidents, founders, and asset managers who oversee billions of dollars. If I have the chance to speak to you and say one thing from my heart, it's this. Understand that there is profound injustice happening in this country, and it's been happening for as long as any of us can remember, and it eats away at us every day. Nothing changes until people decide it's unconscionable for things to continue the way they are. It feels like we may have reached that point, and I stand with the people who are taking a stand for change, even if all I have is a little newsletter. Pretty strong. And mostly excellent. And I feel a little bad about nitpicking, but I'm going to nitpick a little bit. It's really important that people whose jobs are to relate news, and that's basically what this guy's job is, to tell the true story. So when he says Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times while walking away, I think that's pretty misleading. I don't know yet whether this was what they would call a good shoot or not. I don't know. But what I do know is he was disobeying a police officer, doing something that one could imagine a police officer as perceiving as leading to an act of violence, potentially against that police officer, and leaning into a car to get who knows what. So saying shot in the back while walking away, And I don't like it when you mislead because it weakens the rest of your message.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW, Denver. Now, Impact Traffic.